Russia invades Ukraine.
Куда, сын, на работе я одна? Куда мне бежать? Свое жилье должны покидать. Что это такое?
We have team coverage of the crisis with breaking developments from Washington and from the heart of the battle on the ground in Ukraine. Plus, a look at why and how Christians should pray. And we'll take you to Jerusalem for a look at the ripple effect of the crisis in Ukraine when it comes to Israel. All these stories and more are coming up next in the CBN Newsroom.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
And thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ephraim Graham. Nations are begging for peace as Russia continues its full-scale invasion. Russian citizens are even burning their passports, protesting in solidarity with Ukraine as the Kremlin continues its assault. Ukraine is asking for help while getting ready for the end of the Ukrainian government. The outskirts of Kyiv felt the brunt of the aggression after unleashing airstrikes on cities and military bases. Intelligence warns of Russian spies and saboteurs seen near Kyiv. Every day, people have been forced to hide in subway tunnels from missile strikes now targeting residential buildings. Kyiv is home to more than 2.8 million people. Many have become journalists on the ground using cell phones to capture the first images of war.
We are outraged by credible reports that Russian soldiers are currently holding the staff of the Chernobyl facilities hostage.
Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time.
Putin also raised another threat. Russia might use nuclear weapons if anyone tried to use military action to stop its takeover of Ukraine. And Putin may have more on his mind than just Ukraine. CBN's George Thomas is in Lviv, Ukraine right now. So, George, what is the latest on the fighting?
Russian troops basically have surrounded the capital city of Kyiv. They're not in the heart of the city, which is Maidan. You'll remember that's where the revolution erupted 8 years ago. But they're on the outskirts, basically surrounding the capital. Obviously, it'll all depend on how much resistance they face. But I mean, the capital could completely fall into the hands of the Russians, maybe within 24 hours or less.
So are Ukrainian citizens taking arms and fighting back?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, President Zelensky urged everyone between the ages of 18 and 60 to take up arms. In fact, those who have been fleeing west and even going across the border to Poland, men who are in that age group have been stopped and said, you cannot cross the border into Poland. You need to go back and fight. At the end of the day, I mean, look, they are no match for the Russian army. And the reality is that in a fairly short order, Ukraine could be in the hands of the Kremlin.
So what's the mood of the people where you are? How are they reacting to seeing Russia's onslaught?
Yeah, I mean, here in Lviv, in the western part of the country, today, I think there were probably 5, 6 air raids. Each of those air raids, I've got my backpack already assembled. Everything's in there, my passport, my camera, and, you run down the stairs, you go to the basement of the hotel. It's not really a bomb shelter, but in a situation like this, if there is a missile attack, you're always safer at the bottom as opposed to being on the 4th or the 5th floor. But really just a sense of despair, just the incredible shock that an independent, sovereign, democratic country can just like that willy-nilly be taken over by a neighboring country in the 21st century. And many people are saying, in essence, that Ukraine has been sold out, in essence, because, Europeans and America are so concerned about cheap gas.
I tell you, it's been heartbreaking seeing the images. Tell us about threats to Baltic countries and the arrival of more U.S. troops in Latvia.
In Latvia, right next door to Estonia, Lithuania. The United States is deploying extra forces to Latvia. The French say they are sending more troops to Romania. Obviously, these Baltic countries that are right next to Belarus are very, very concerned because after Ukraine, could they be next? And in fact, to this very point, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked point blank, does Putin have aspirations beyond Ukraine? And he said, absolutely. And that is the worry for these Baltic countries.
Indeed it is. George Thomas reporting for us from Lviv, Ukraine. Thank you so much for your time and insight, George. Evangelist Franklin Graham encouraged his social media followers to pray for Russian President Vladimir Putin, and critics lashed out. Here's the message Graham posted regarding Russia's president. This may sound like a strange request, and I might get some angry comments, but we need to pray that God would work in his heart so that war and the loss of thousands of lives could be avoided at all costs. Congressional candidate Scott Huffman is among those who blasted Franklin, saying it's almost like he supports the enemy who is about to declare war and kill people. Still others defended Graham, saying the Bible calls for believers to pray for leaders and enemies. The Dean of Regent School of Divinity, Dr. Cornay Becker, is here now to offer some insight on this debate. So first, what's your take on the criticism that Franklin is seeing for his call to pray for Putin and to pray against war?
Evangelist Graham is absolutely correct that the Bible instructs us to pray, and those that criticize Evangelist Graham might have difficulty understanding the biblical worldview that states that God reigns supreme over all the leaders. The book of Proverbs declares that the heart of the king is like a river of water that the Lord can turn wherever he wants.
Indeed. Why is there a need for Christians to pray for leaders whose actions they oppose?
I think the Apostle Paul says it best. He says, I urge you that all intercessions, supplications, prayers, and thanksgiving be made for all people, and especially for those in authority, so that people can live dignified, holy, quiet lives. And then he says, this is pleasing to the Lord, who desires for all to be saved, right, and come to the knowledge of the truth.
So what do Christians need to come together and do in times like these?
In this time of unprecedented danger, not only for Europe, but for the world, Christians should step away from partisan politics and cry out together to God, who is able to stop these atrocities.
As a theologian, biblical scholar yourself, what are you thinking and seeing as you're watching this all unfold in our world?
Right, it's unprecedented. And my largest concern is not only for the people, of course, of the Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe and the devastating effects that this could have in relationships between Russia and then, of course, the rest of the world.
Is there scripture, or what does the Bible say about these troubling times?
Right. So the scriptures are very clear that in the end times we will see these kind of wars arrive. And there are prophecies in the Old Testament that speaks about a force from the direction of Russia marching on Israel. And so my deepest prayer at this moment in time is that this is not indeed this time.
What would you say to Ukrainians who live here in America and other parts of the world watching this unfold back at home? Any words of comfort or thought for them?
We have to remember that God reigns supreme. And so the best advice that I could have is let us all kneel down. And I'm also concerned about Russians that are living here at the same time, Russians that have goodwill. Can we come together and pray and trust that God is able to stop this madness?
Indeed. Thank you so much. Much appreciated always. In other news, the Biden administration will significantly loosen federal mask-wearing guidelines to protect against COVID-19 transmission. That's expected today. That means most Americans will no longer be advised to wear masks indoors or public settings. Masks have been recommended for people residing in communities with substantial or high transmission under current guidelines. That's roughly 95% of U.S. counties. Under the new guidelines, the vast majority of Americans will no longer live in areas where indoor masking in public is recommended. A federal judge convicted the 3 Minneapolis police officers who, alongside Derek Chauvin, were on the scene of the murder of George Floyd. Tal J. Alexander, Kuhn, and Thomas Lane were all convicted of violating Floyd's civil rights. And coming up right here on CBN NewsWatch, how is Israel affected now that Russia is invading Ukraine? Our Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell is standing by in Jerusalem with some insight. Stay with us for more on that next. We'll be right back. There are several stories making headlines in the Middle East, including the impact Israel is feeling now that Russia is invading Ukraine. Also, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett criticizing an emerging deal over Iran's nuclear program. For more on these stories, we're joined now by Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem. So, Chris, with the invasion of Ukraine happening right now, what impact is that having where you are?
Well, Ephraim, it's actually having a major impact, and Israel is trying to walk a diplomatic tightrope. They have good relations with Ukraine. It's a democratic country, but they also have relations with Russia in terms of actually their security needs. What I mean by that is that for the last several years, Israel has been a shadow war, involved in a shadow war with Iran, trying to hit Iranian-backed militias, trying to stop Iran from making Syria itself a staging ground for an attack on Israel. Now, Russia is basically the de facto power in Syria, and it has permitted these attacks by the Israeli Air Force against Iranian targets. Now, earlier this week, Israel made a diplomatic stand. They stood with Ukraine, and they didn't quite condemn Russia's invasion, but they did support Ukraine. They said they would support and send humanitarian aid. In response, Russia has said, first of all, they will consider or reconsider allowing Israel to make those attacks against Iran. And also, they just came out just a day or two ago, said they did not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So there did seem to be almost immediate in impact diplomatically on Israel's relationship with Russia that will affect its security situation inside Syria.
Chris, why is Prime Minister Naftali Bennett criticizing Iran's nuclear deal?
Because it was promoted, Ephraim, by the U.S. It would be a longer and stronger deal. He thinks it's a shorter and weaker deal. He thinks it's going to pave a way for Iran to get enriched uranium on military grade to be able to build a nuclear bomb. So that is the concern of Israel. And they're so concerned that they are preparing, if necessary, to go ahead and strike Iran's nuclear facilities in a military strike. And that would exacerbate things here in the Middle East exponentially, just like Russia's invasion of Ukraine has. So it's a very, very dangerous and difficult situation for Israel right now.
Let's turn to the battle against COVID-19 for a moment. Israel is expected to open its doors to all foreigners, including the unvaccinated, March 1st. What are some prerequisites to that?
Well, two things. First of all, you have a negative test before you get on the plane. You have to negative test when you get off the plane. But this is an answer to prayer for millions of people who want to come here to Israel, certainly for many of the people inside Israel that depend on tourism, the people in the hotels, tour guides, bus operators. It's a really a sort of a lifting of this barrier that had been on Israel for 2 years. It was 2 years ago in 2020 in March when literally tourists had to leave the country. Now it looks like vaccinated and unvaccinated tourists will be able to come back. It's a really welcome sign for many people here in Israel.
Indeed, I can imagine. What can we expect this week on Jerusalem Dateline?
Well, we'll too have a perspective on what's happening in Ukraine. We have an interview with the chief rabbi of Kyiv and his decision of his family to stay and help people there. We also have a report, as we have had this morning, another perspective from George Thomas. And we're going to have a geopolitical analysis of what this means for Israel. And as I explained, some of the geopolitical diplomatic tightrope that Israel is going through right now. So we'll have all that analysis and more on this week's Jerusalem Dateline, Ephraim.
Great insight to look forward to, as always. Thank you so much, Chris. Much appreciated. I want to remind you at home that you can see more from Chris Mitchell and the entire Middle East Bureau team on the CBN News Channel tonight at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. That is Jerusalem Dateline. You can also download the CBN News app and watch it at your leisure. Still ahead, it is one of the oldest black churches in America, and it is being rebuilt. See how archaeologists are uncovering history and bringing healing when we come back. Archaeologists in Williamsburg, Virginia are uncovering the oldest black church in America dating back to colonial times. The rich history of First Baptist Church is now the subject of a documentary that producers say tell the whole story, not just half the story. Wendy Griffith explains.
Ringing a bell from the First Baptist Church in Virginia, one of the oldest black churches in America, founded under a grove of trees in 1776.
It's a story 245 years in the making. The story of black Americans, free and slaves, gathering in secret to pray and worship together.
It was a time when they weren't supposed to be worshiping together. That was a big risk, and they took that risk to fulfill their faith.
Producers say the documentary, History Half Told is Untold, tells the amazing story of how white colonist Jesse Cole gave black enslaved preacher Moses a small 16 by 20 foot carriage house for worship.
Sit down, down, sit down. Sit down and take your rest.
The story coming out of Bruton Parish is that Jesse Cole's wife loved the worship service that the blacks did so much. She would come home and open her window and enjoy the songs and the service. And the good thing about this is we found the descendants of that family, and the story is the same. So the parallel history integrates, and that's what we're trying to do with this film.
After a tornado destroyed it, a second church built on the site in 1856 stood for 100 years. The rich history of First Baptist, however, was literally covered up when the city put a parking lot over the land and paid for a new church building a few blocks away. Thanks to efforts by Colonial Williamsburg and the Let Freedom Ring Foundation, archaeologists began uncovering the history, and Harshaw says that is bringing healing.
You have some descendants right now that are still living that saw this process, this church at 1856 structure being knocked down and covered up with an asphalt parking lot. They're now getting to ride by and see it being uncovered.
And that's helping bring the community, black and white, together.
I want people to feel that healing can happen, that togetherness, it can happen. All of the things that we thought could not happen, all we have to do is come together and recognize each other's humanity and that we all serve the same God.
The goal is to reconstruct the 1818 church right here on the site of where archaeologists discovered the remnants of the original meeting house, which eventually became known as First Baptist Church.
It was probably a very lightly built structure, wooden siding that comes up from a brick foundation. We uncovered that several months ago, and it will not survive long being exposed to the elements like we're experiencing today. So we are backfilling it right now, and it will stay covered for the time being. And the hope and the expectation is that we will be able to rebuild that once the whole project is finished.
Important discoveries so far include a 1-cent coin dating back to 1817, copper pins common on women's clothing at the time, and about 30 grave sites. The dig is scheduled to continue through this year. Then work will begin on a reconstructed church. The goal, to open doors to the public by the fall of 2026, in time for the First Baptist 250th anniversary celebration. Wendy Griffith, CBN News, Williamsburg.
And you can see the documentary History Half Told is Untold tonight through February 27th at 8 p.m. on the CBN News Channel. Stay tuned for your Friday Faithful. It's coming up next. In the hours before Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens were preparing for war. For some, that meant carrying weapons on the street. For a group of young Ukrainians, it meant singing a beautiful chorus as the shelling began. CBN's George Thomas captured some of the voices of some of those brave young people singing about their beloved nation in downtown Lviv. The lyrics essentially translate to, we will fight for freedom, we will die for our country. Many people are praying for God's intervention and wisdom and for protection over so many innocent lives during these tumultuous times. It is time now for your Friday Faithful. I want to leave you with this word as we wrap a very busy week in the world. Do good and don't get tired of doing good. God will reward you for your faithfulness, and He will be faithful. With that word, I encourage you to have a fabulous Friday, and be sure to have yourself a wonderful weekend, regardless of what's going on in your life and around your life. God remains faithful. That is going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. You can always find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel at any time. You can also find them online at cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today. You can email us, newswatch@cbn.com. You can also reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Hope you'll join us again right back here come Monday. Goodbye, everybody, and God bless.